In this episode, I want to talk about the concept of Militia Est Vita, or in other words, the idea that army or warfare can be adopted as a vision for life itself. To provide just a little bit of background, Militia Est Vita is Latin. It comes from the Bible. In fact, the book of Job, specifically chapter 7, verse 1, and the full line in Latin is Militia Est Vita Hominis Super Terram. And the best translation I could give you is something to the effect of life for man on this earth is like a military struggle or a military campaign. In other words, preserved in that idea, and the idea of Militia Est Vita is the idea that when we are born, when we, so to speak, come to this earth, that we're not sent here just to fart around. Quote a writer I like very much, actually, Kurt Vonnegut. Um, but this view of life, at least, might find that kind of commentary perhaps entertaining and even a little bit funny, but totally off the mark. Of course, we're not here to fart around. Sorry, Vonnegut. We're not here on a journey. Uh, we're not here to enjoy ourselves, or at least that's not the primary purpose of our existence. Uh, and really, we're not even here to sort of figure ourselves out unless by so doing, we make of ourselves better soldiers for the higher power that sent us here. Let's unpack that just a little bit further. This idea is not unique to the book of Job, chapter 7, verse 1, or indeed to Christianity. It is, in fact, an idea that is in many respects perennial, which is to say, it is timeless and spaceless and has been developed and adopted and lived probably for about as long as people have been on this earth, adopting and developing and living visions of life, so to speak. It's cross-cultural, cross geographical, and cross-temporal. It's an idea that exists outside of time and space and even crosses cultural boundaries. We see examples of men who lived this sort of idea in one expression or another in the samurai, for example, who were extraordinarily learned warriors, right? These were sort of, interestingly enough, literary figures who were not only masters of the martial arts, but spent, as may be well known to those of you who have ever had any interest in the samurai, who many of whom spent most of their lives studying literature, philosophy, spirituality, and poetry in particular. It was extraordinarily popular during at least certain periods of the existence of the samurai, sort of at their height, for individual samurai to practice writing death poems their entire life. And it was, in fact, considered a great a great dishonor to die without having composed uh, uh, a death poem, usually very short, and something approximating a haiku, if not exactly in that form. We see examples, of course, in European history as well. The Knights Templar, the Teutonic Knights of the Germanic uh, tribes. At that point, they weren't really Germanic tribes anymore, but of the area that today we would call Germany is what I mean to say. And there are examples that even enter into modernity, although this is a vision of life that has largely been almost totally lost on modernity, but we still see it with respect to those members of, for example, the military that are operating at the highest possible level, special forces and things like that, right? But the idea is that there are forces in opposition to one another. And it's precisely this dynamic state of tension that, in some respects, holds the universe and existence itself together. And these two opposing forces have been described differently at different times by different people. But the general idea is that on one side, there are forces of what we might call logos, which, and I'm not at all doing this Greek word justice here, but for the sake of brevity and also accessibility, we'll say that logos, uh, in this sense, represents sort of the universe's will to order. And so we're also talking about forces of order and what we might call cosmos and integration and articulation. And these forces are at odds with lower, more infernal, excuse me, forces. Um, so opposed to cosmos or order, there's chaos, there is disintegration, there is disarticulation, there is a will toward destruction. Um, Essentially, we're talking about that which is secundum naturam, that which is consistent with nature, and that which is versus that which is contra naturam, that which is against nature or inconsistent with nature. And the idea, the expressed by Militia Est Vita, or kind of warfare as a vision of life itself, then implies that when we're sent here, we are, so to speak, conscripted into war, into a war. We are sent from above to a lower material plane, namely the earth and the material universe such as we know it. And at that point, we have a choice to make. Having been conscripted, you decide. Each individual decides. You either serve the forces of logos, of order, of cosmos, or you serve the forces of chaos, of disorder, of disintegration. And there's really no third option, because even to decide not to fight is to pick a side. um, namely the side of disorder and chaos and disarticulation. Um, because what because I think it's fair to say that evil exists shouldn't surprise anyone. Evil has always existed. What increasingly surprises me more and more is the total lack of courage or willingness uh, for supposedly good men to do anything about it. It's worth remarking in this regard that in Dante's Inferno, there is a special section, if you like, in hell reserved for who we might call fence sitters, those who during times, particularly in times of extreme, sort of dynamic tension, didn't choose a side. And this idea is very much tied in to an idea that I'm more and more seeing um, articulated and spoken about, even kind of in the popular culture and consciousness, which is really remarkable. And that's the idea that strong men create good times create weak men create hard times, and hard times create strong men. It seems perfectly obvious to me, frankly, just an observation of fact and of perfectly obvious fact, that we are living in hard times that have been created by exceedingly weak men. And there's undoubtedly growing awareness about this, probably among young men especially, but I think this awareness is spreading more broadly across Western culture and Western civilization, such as it is a little bit more broadly. And accompanied by this awareness is the increasing recognition that it's more and more every day necessary to develop and adopt in practice a more masculine, broadly stoic, and even military or warlike orientation toward life itself. Now, when we talk about adopting a military or warlike orientation, and when we talk about when we're born, having been essentially conscripted into warfare, I think it's important to mention that we're not only referring to material war at the material level, physical combat. Although, of course, the war between the forces of order and the forces of disorder, the war between the forces of cosmos and the forces of chaos, that war certainly manifests at the physical level. There's no doubt about that. But in some respects, that is, and this is actually consistent with certain ideas apropos of the Islamic tradition, that there is a greater war and a lesser war. And the lesser war in the Islamic tradition is actually that physical material war of sort of man against man at the physical level, the material level. To call it the lesser war isn't to say that it's not important, that it can't be brutal, and that it's not to deny that sometimes fighting at that level isn't necessary. In fact, it may be the case that it's increasingly necessary to be prepared to fight at that level. Yet, there still exists, not only in this Islamic tradition, but it's articulated by the Islamic tradition, and I think in a manner that is really quite poignant. There still exists beyond that the greater war, and that's the spiritual war. It refers in some respect to the war within ourselves against those elements of ourselves that pull us down. And it's, almost the devil and the angel on the shoulder, like you see in cartoons, right? It's the in that sense, it's the war against that devil on one shoulder, uh, trying to tempt you into serving through various means and mechanisms and modes the forces of chaos, versus taking heed and listening to the angel on your shoulder who is trying to encourage you to look upward and to strive upward and to serve something greater than yourself. And more specifically, to be willing to fight externally and internally to do whatever you can to bring about and sustain and defend that which serves at the altar of order and cosmos and logos, the universal will toward transcendent meaning, truth with a capital T, right? And although this awareness, in as much as I could tell, seems to be growing, and that's something that I personally welcome with open arms, I think this awareness is still exceedingly nascent, which is to say that it's still in a kind of developmental stage. It still lacks much in the way of form. There are a few individuals who have kind of taken up the mantle and might be described as thought leaders in this particular regard. Just a couple of minutes searching YouTube will confirm to anyone that doubts this that there is a big market, uh, in particular with particular respect to young men who are looking uh, for guides and guidelines, and who are really desperate, whether they'd articulate it precisely this way, who are really desperate for a philosophy of life that instills, or at least begins to instill, some sense of greater meaning and purpose, especially, again, whether they would articulate it this way, especially at the spiritual level, right? And there are some people speaking to this really profound issue um, with varying degrees of success, I suppose, and taking or articulating their viewpoints in ways that, in some respects, overlap, and other ways diverge. But as far as I can tell, there still isn't really, well, I guess what I mean to say is despite there clearly being a growing awareness of this, it seems clear to me that most people, including those individuals who have kind of assumed the role of thought leaders in this particular regard, have still not really yet fully grasped the necessity of integrating some of the more material and worldly details into a superior order, into something transcendent, in other words. So, there are lots of people talking about discipline and responsibility, and even psychophysical strengthening, right? Lots of people talking about stoicism, um, and the importance of kind of manning up, to use that slightly vulgar phrase, um, and even more rarely, there are a few people talking about the importance even of spiritual training, but as of yet, no one has emerged, at least at a really high level, or at a really public level, who seems to have grasped the necessity of integrating all of these details into a superior order, constituted not only by a general vision of life, but constituted by a will toward the transcendent, toward realms above and beyond man. I think this speaks in part to the idea that there's a persistent view of philosophy that's not particularly new, and it's unfortunately particularly persistent and indeed entrenched in the Anglophone world, which is to say the English speaking world. And that idea is that philosophy is, for most people, totally off the radar. But even for those that have a little bit of interest in it, it's the idea that philosophy is something that you read in order to, usually at best, let's be honest, um, bank away so that you could withdraw little tidbits of information to correctly answer a question or respond to an essay prompt on a test, or to maybe impress some people by making yourself seem interesting at a party. But that's not at all how the world of antiquity, for example, viewed philosophy. Philosophy for the ancients and for those of a more traditional mindset is something to be lived, not just learned and banked away, or relegated to you know bookshelves, whether whether frequently visited or on the dusty side. It's something to be integrated into oneself and used toward the end of developing a general vision of life that propels one toward that which is more than one, that which is transcendent. Marcus Aurelius, the famous Roman emperor and probably the foremost representative of Stoicism, encapsulates this idea really well in a particular quote of his that I'll share with you. He says, quote, "Most people lack a coherent philosophy of life. Days are spent chasing temporary pleasures and avoiding discomfort. These people are slaves to the immediate, attracted by any distraction to not confront their situation, any excuse to avoid the big question. Is this how I want to live?" Living without philosophy is living without direction, without an internal compass to guide our lives. We will follow the path marked by the submissive masses of men. We will absorb without questioning the values and aspirations of society, and we will die without having actually lived. And that's a really, really astonishingly, considering that Marcus Aurelius lived many, many centuries ago. an astonishing take. And I don't know whether I'm prepared to say it's more relevant now than it was during Aurelius's time, but it certainly is relevant now as it's ever been. And it's true that most people absolutely lack a coherent philosophy of life. Most people absolutely spend their days chasing temporary pleasures and avoiding discomfort. That's the highest good that most people believe they could possibly serve, right? Their own pleasure, their own comfort. Most people are absolutely, and when I say most people, I mean most people. I don't mean some people. I don't mean a lot of people. I don't mean many people. I mean most people are slaves to the immediate, attracted by any distraction to not confront their situation, any excuse to avoid the big question: is this how I want to live? Talk about hitting the nail on the head, right? And this is something we desperately need. Not only men, um, but all people. We need a philosophy. We need a coherent philosophy of life, which has been totally lost to the modern world, that is interested, as Aurelius points out, almost without exception, in what is immediate, what is imminent, what is material, that which distracts us, that which is rooted almost solely in pleasure, or at least avoiding discomfort, right? Um, this is what you get when you have a culture whose values, in a subtle way, in a mediated way, in a transliterated way, but ultimately from one boundary of that culture to the other. This is what you get when that culture's values are dominated by the ethics of merchants. As an alternative, Militia Est Vita, army as a vision of life. Obviously, I think it should be obvious, posits a warlike orientation or system of ethics, which is to say, a system of ethics that are more consistent with that of the warrior. This takes us back to the very first episode of this podcast, with respect to our discussion of the four cardinal virtues of Stoicism: wisdom, justice, courage, temperance. These are the values of warriors, right? Merchants aren't interested in temperance. If you run a distillery or a brewery, or if you're a pornographer, you don't want people to be temperate. You want people addicted to booze, and you want people addicted to pornography. Truth, even, really is a little bit lost on the merchant, in so much as if you own and run a store that sells, I don't know, fans, right? Um, you're going to invest tons of money in marketing that tries to convince as many people as possible that your fans are the best fans. Uh, Whether that's true is totally notwithstanding. The guy right next door might sell better fans. Your ethics, if you're a merchant, has nothing to do with telling the truth and everything to do with selling a product, with generating revenue, right? Some merchants may be more truthful than others. Don't misunderstand me. I don't mean to say that every person that owns a business is a liar or a bad person. We're speaking broadly and very generally about systems of ethics that take root at the highest possible levels of a culture, and even go beyond a culture and come down to a culture, from that which is transcendent, or up to a culture from below, from that which is infernal. So let's unpack a little bit more of this idea of Militia Est Vita. Uh, and indeed, I think that we find ourselves in a realm, first and foremost, of ethics. There is an ethical aspect to this concept that we need to consider, right? And the first thing I think to remember, and this is especially true of European and Western civilization, is that if we take the time, as fewer and fewer people do, unfortunately, to study our history and our culture and our ancient traditions, our literary traditions, our spiritual traditions, etc., we will find, certainly not by chance, I should mention, that we often see the recurrent use of symbolism that is taken very directly from fighting and serving and asserting oneself heroically. And it's worth pointing out that the use of this symbolism, or rather, it's worth pointing out that this symbolism is often used to express at the material level what in fact represents spiritual realities. Um, most of the great works uh, I taught literature for a number of years, about 6 years at the university level and about 2 years at the secondary level. And if you study early British literature in particular, and even earlier American literature, but early British literature in particular, and this is true for languages beyond English, incidentally, you'll see this in German, French as well. The literature is, if not entirely, almost exclusively heroic in its character, in its tone and interpretation. Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Beowulf, right? Um, Over and over again, you see, often as metaphor, expressions of the heroic, um, expressions of the truly heroic have almost been entirely lost on modern culture. The best you get, really, I mean, when I think of like superhero movies or something like that, it's how this is maybe where I'll really start stepping on people's toes. I know they love their their Hollywood movies or superhero movies. Um, it you know your Marvel movies. I'm going to be honest with you here because you need me to be honest with you, friends. Your Marvel movies are a real poor substitute for Homer. They're a real pale simulacrum of Beowulf. They don't quite do justice to the the mythos surrounding King Arthur, the Arthurian legends, the Knights of the Round Table, um, even Shakespeare, and the capacity for heroism we see in a lot of the great works of the Elizabethan period. Um, all of your Hollywood is a really, really sad and rather dilapidated and degenerated surrogate for Sophocles or Euripides or Aeschylus, the great Greek tragedians. It's something that's been entirely lost, which is fascinating because if you study even at an intermediary level, or for that matter, an introductory level, the ancient traditions, literary traditions, spiritual traditions, etc., you see that Europeans in particular um, were, I think it's fair to say, the greatest warriors the earth has ever seen. A little slow to start, maybe, but once they get started, oh boy. And internal, volitional, energetic, life affirming vision of life itself was almost totally ubiquitous for most of Western and European history, right up to the modern world, where the view is increasingly that the soldier is, certainly the warrior, is anachronistic and no longer necessary, is antiquated. And anyone interested in a warlike view of life, anyone interested in a warrior type of ethics, at best is just looking for, it's increasingly regarded just as an excuse for brutality, right? But that's not what the warrior's about. And it's not, for that matter, what masculinity is about. Masculinity is about self control, it's about power, but it's about ventilating power when it's necessary to use it and through the appropriate and proper channels in the appropriate and proper ways, right? We see this in classic Roman art. Symbols of agony are recurrent in sacred representations of classic Roman art. And of course, these pass in part to Catholic asceticism itself, right? Anyone who's even remotely familiar with the Catholic aesthetic tradition knows that there recur um, representations of suffering and agony. Um, but for my part, at least, um, these representations of suffering and agony are almost always accompanied, if only as a subtext, but often more plainly than that, by a sense of transcendent heroism and overbecoming and willingness to sacrifice, right? The martyrs, the saints, many of whom were warriors, right? So what we're really dealing with here, though, I think is something much more precise than the kind of mere analogies I've been trying to use to as a way for us to enter into this conversation, find some footing so we're not totally lost at sea, and begin um, to develop an understanding of this concept. But beyond these mere analogies, essentially what we're talking about is the doctrine of holy war and the idea that that's what life is. Life is a holy war. And as I mentioned earlier, when you are born, you are conscripted into that holy war. And you decide, no one could decide for you. You decide which side are you going to serve in this holy war? The forces of order or the forces of chaos? The forces of integration or the forces of disintegration? The forces of nature or the forces of that which is contra naturam? And if you're willing, and for that matter, capable of taking this understanding beyond the realm of mere analogy and adopting it not only as an interesting idea, but really integrating it into the fiber of your being, you will find that this attitude brings about a radical change of meaning and purpose in your whole field of values. It will raise you to a plane of manliness that separates you from all sort of middling, mass-oriented, bovine, bourgeois attitudes that separate you even from superficial and ultimately meaningless humanitarianism and moralism and the limp conformism of the bovine bourgeois masses, and takes you to another level. If you really adopt this as a vision of life and not just as an interesting theoretical concept, right? If you really believe, as in Job 7:1, Militia Est Vita, hominis super terram, life for man on this earth is warfare. I have been sent here by a higher power to fight a war on behalf of logos, of cosmos, of order. And it's a matter of genuinely conceiving oneself in that way, right? Of genuinely believing, not as an allegory, not as an analogy, not as a metaphor, genuinely believing, body, mind, and soul, that you have been sent to earth, which is in some respects a lower material plane or realm. And you have been sent here in the guise of a man on a mission of military service. And the earth appears then as some kind of remote front, right? Not unlike a Roman soldier who's sent out to the furthest reaches of the empire. And indeed, like that Roman soldier, the purpose of your mission may not always be directly sensed or directly clear to you, right? It's the same for someone who fights at some far off outpost who maybe can't always discern or form or formulate an absolutely precise idea of the overall plan to which his action contributes. In other words, you're not always going to understand how exactly your situation, especially your suffering, and the calls for you to be heroic when it's difficult to be heroic, and to be brave when it's difficult to be brave, and to be wise when it's difficult to be wise, and to be temperate when it's difficult to be temperate, and to be just when it's difficult to be just, and when it seems, especially as though you've been asked to fight, to hold maybe what appears to be a losing position. It's going to be difficult to understand how what you have been asked to do, which at times probably seems impossible, how that contributes to the overall plan. But the key is to cultivate, as with Stoicism and similar systems of values and ethics, an inner nobility, an inner strength, an inner nobility and inner strength in particular that's measured precisely by the fact of resisting and of accomplishing despite all, and even in spite of all, what must be accomplished, because that's your assignment, because you've been assigned to do it, because you've been assigned to hold that position. And you don't doubt, and you don't hesitate, and you're bound to this idea by a fidelity that is stronger than life or death. And if you're capable of elevating yourself to this level, you will find that some of the initial results that manifest in your own life, both externally and certainly internally, is a totally affirmative, life affirming, positive attitude with respect to the world. You will find yourself much more assertive. And at the same time, you will find a certain freedom. And that may seem counter propositional. How could you be free if sort of uh, beyond the confines of your own will, you've been sent to fight a war that you've been, if you've been conscripted, if you didn't volunteer, right? But here's the thing: whoever is really, I'll uh, I'll use the word God. I know that means a lot. That can mean different things to different people, but because it's the best word I could think to use, and it's the most accessible way to express that higher force or that higher power, I'm going to use the word God here. If you're really one of God's warriors by nature, right? If your nature is a warrior nature, if at a psycho spiritual level, it's just inborn, you are one of God's warriors by nature, then you're therefore a warrior because you want to be. And in those missions and in those tasks which are given to you, however difficult they may seem, however difficult they may genuinely be, consequently, you will recognize yourself. Moreover, the more you conceive genuinely of existence as from the point of view of a warrior in an army of God against forces of disorder and disintegration that are hell bent on the destruction of everything beautiful and everything good and everything orderly. Pretty soon, if you genuinely integrate and adopt this viewpoint into the fundamental fiber of your existence, pretty soon you'll find yourself very far from considering the world some kind of veil of tears from which you need to flee, because that's cowardice. And neither will the world seem, as so many modern secular atheistic types claim it is, neither will the world seem this sort of circus of irrational events at which you should just throw yourself blindly, right? Because it's all random and it's all by chance and it's not really underpinned by any transcendent meaning or truth at the capital T. Certainly, you won't see the world as a realm for which carpe diem, seize the day, constitutes the supreme wisdom. Don't misunderstand me. The warrior, maybe more so than most, will be perfectly well aware of the tragic and even the negative side of many things, of life itself, indeed. But his way of reacting to tragedy and of reacting to negativity and of reacting to that which is both physically and even psychologically, and for that matter, spiritually difficult, will be very different from the way other men respond to these edifices. Because you will feel that this world is not your homeland. This earth is not your fatherland. And the human condition does not represent fully your proper condition. Instead, you will not believe, not even understand, you will know that you have been sent here from elsewhere, from afar, from a higher plane or realm of existence. And this will remain for you a fundamental element, a fundamental awareness and knowledge that will prevent the giving rise to forms of escapism or spiritual weakness. In fact, believing that you have been sent here from afar by God to wage war against the enemies of God, which abound everywhere. Feeling this way will minimize and relativize all of what otherwise to weaker men seems inconquerable and unfair and unjust and even unlucky, because you will be able to refer, to take as your reference point for every action you undertake, and indeed for your existence yourself. You will be able to refer to higher concepts of measure and of limit, beginning with the idea of death itself, right? And this will confer upon you, and it takes practice, but this will confer on you a sense of calm force and a breath of vision. And this conception of life then will lead to a radically new sense, not only of oneself, but also of social and even political solidarity, because there's not just an internal, personal, ethical aspect, which is really what we've been unpacking so far, but there are also reverberations with respect to the adoption of this vision of life that touch upon the social aspect. It will take you beyond all modern, postmodern, contemporary humanitarianism and quote unquote socialism, which is kind of a loaded word, can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. But in other words, you will understand perfectly well that men are not our brothers, and that, and I might step on some Christian feet here, I don't mean to do that, but frankly, the idea that everyone is our neighbor is an insolent concept. That everyone is our brother, that every man is our brother, we're all brothers and sisters. These are to a man who has adopted a properly warlike ethics, to a man for whom Militia Est Vita, the suggestion that we are all equal, that we are all the same, that we're all brothers and sisters, and that we're all neighbors, is offensive and insolent. Society, for such a man, society itself, is not a creature of necessity, and neither is it something to be justified on the basis of some idealistic, honeyed, universal love or obligatory altruism, right? Instead, you will conceive not just your own society, but every society in the present, in the past, and into the future as being conceived in terms of the solidarity that exists between quite distinct beings, each one determined to protect the dignity of its personality, but nevertheless united in common action, which binds them side by side without any sort of sentimentalism in male comradeship. We're talking about values of fidelity and sincerity. We're talking about an ethics of honor that will give rise to an entirely new basis of thinking about yourself and of your community, and to speak more particularly, of whom you consider to be part of your community. Also, to continue speaking a little bit about the social aspect and the communal aspect of this warlike ethics, it leads more or less to an attitude that inclines one to limit the principle of solidarity, especially by means that you only extend your solidarity brotherhood or neighborhood. That these are not concepts that are going to be extended to just anyone. They're concepts or categories that you extend to to others based upon their dignity and your affinity for them, right? The warrior can only regard as his comrade those who he can esteem, those who he can trust to hold their posts and not give way. He's not going to extend dignity or affinity or brotherhood to the cowardly, to the liar, to the weak, or to the inept, right? We have a duty when we understand ourselves to be warriors of gathering around ourselves and pushing forward only valid forces, just like a general has that duty, or a military leader has that duty, right? We we have no time in the middle of a genuine spiritual holy war to waste our time or our concern on those who are weak or inept, even to a degree to those who have already fallen, although they should be paid their dues, right? And all of this altogether speaks to developing something we've talked about on virtually almost every episode of this podcast, which is the importance of developing a sense of stoicism, right? The views we're putting forward here, even as we talk about warfare and fighting, and give examples of interesting observations about Indo-European legislation. The views we're putting forward here are actually much more valuable in terms of the psycho-spiritual than they are in terms of the physical, right? We're talking about forms of inner strengthening, which bring us into a field of a properly traditional ethics, which is what we should be aspiring toward, getting back to the origins, especially the origins and the roots of distinctly and uniquely European modes of believing and knowing and thinking and acting, right? We're speaking of trying to bring about more so than even a physical change, although physical fitness obviously has its place in this form of ethics, right? I believe it was Socrates that said that the man who doesn't push his body to his limits and come to know its own beauty and strength shames himself. I'm paraphrasing. That's a quote I believe by Socrates, and as much as it comes down to us from Plato, and that has its place. But really, what we're speaking about here, especially with respect to talking of a sense of stoicism, is an attempt to bring about a radical interchange, by virtue of which one's reactions toward facts and life experiences becomes absolutely different, especially when compared to, we'll call them moderns, right? And rather than being negative, um, as with Stoicism, and if you want a good introduction to Stoicism, check out the very first episode of this podcast, an introduction to Stoicism. Rather than being negative, what we find, in fact, is that our responses are generally positive and life affirming and constructive, right? And Stoic philosophy, per usual, at least to my thinking, offers us maybe the best insight into this type of ethics, into this warlike type of ethics, into an ethics characterized by a sense that militia est vita. But of course, is provided only that we understand what Stoicism really means, right? That we understand Stoicism as a true and indomitable life affirmation. Uh, the popular view of Stoicism, such as it's preconceived, is that the Stoic is this kind of stiffened, hardened being who's foreign to life, who is um, sort of maybe even nihilistic and totally uncaring And that's not the case, right? If you want a better introduction into Stoicism, check out our introduction into Stoicism, which I think is reasonably accessible. But certainly we can go so far as to say this: when you read the great Stoic authors, when you read Aurelius, when you read Seneca, when you read Epictetus and others, you will find precisely many elements that are wonderfully conducive precisely to this warlike system of ethics, which will revolutionize completely the common manner of thinking, especially the common manner of thinking that is characteristic of modernity and postmodernity. And that's especially summed up, I think, by a very characteristic aspect of this viewpoint, which is this: the one who is sent off to a dangerous place, the one who is given a difficult, even seemingly impossible assignment, will only curse his fate if he's a vile person, if he's a coward, if he's unworthy of that affinity and dignity and sense of fraternity about which we spoke earlier. If, on the other hand, this person is of a truly heroic spirit, a truly heroic spirit, he will be proud of his situation. He will be proud of having been sent to a dangerous place. He will be proud of having been given a difficult assignment because he knows that good commanders, and there's no better commander than God. He knows that good commanders choose only the worthiest and the strongest for any risky mission or for any post characterized by true, important, real responsibility. Right? Those whom the commander cannot hold in esteem, these individuals, to use a military term, are left in the rear with the gear, right? And it's important to understand, this is a military analogy, of course, but to take this analogy, to push it beyond its own limits and to apply it more broadly to life. Remember, there is the greater war and the lesser war. And the lesser war is the material war. The greater war is the war that occurs internally and externally at the psychological level, at the spiritual level. This same idea that we only curse our fate if we're vile, we only curse a dangerous assignment or a difficult assignment if we're vile, this same thought is appropriate to the most absolutely dark, tragic, and discouraging moments of our lives. You will see, if you adopt wholeheartedly this transcendent ethics, that it's necessary to discover in the darkest moments of your life, in the most tragic moments of your life, in the most discouraging moments of your life, you will see that it's necessary for you to discover either one, a hidden provincialism, some hidden gem, some lesson to be learned, some new door to be opened, some new opportunity to be explored, or two, to see it as an appeal to your nobility and your superiority. Reminds me a little bit of something that Jordan Peterson says, right? If you could get yourself to the point that when your father dies, you have the inner strength and fortitude to get yourself together and help plan his funeral, then that situation, dark, tragic, and discouraging though it may have been, is an appeal to your nobility and an appeal to your superiority. Because life is going to be hard. Life is tragic. I think this is right out of Peterson as well, about whom I have mixed feelings, in so much as that's even necessary to say in a podcast like this. But when he's on, he's on. Um, And he says, look, like suffering is a certainty. Everyone you know is going to die. Everything you do is going to eventually fail. That's not some sort of pessimistic negativity. That's just the truth. And so we need to be able to find, in spite of all this, despite and even in spite of all this, either an opportunity to uncover a hidden provincialism, a providence, or to see it as an appeal to our nobility and our superiority and to our strength, especially our inner strength. And so we see that this vision of one's very existence, of one's life, as constituting membership within an army of God, gives shape, brings about an ethic that is in some respects all of its own. And it will engender in you, if you undertake its development seriously, a precise inner attitude which will arouse profoundly deep and powerful forces within you. But it's important to understand that it's necessary first to feel oneself to be a soldier in spirit, to understand that what we're really talking about is occurring at the spiritual level, and to attempt to render one's sensibility in accordance with that order, in order to be able to then go on to act along these lines in a material sense only subsequently. Because if we don't understand this as being rooted first in the spiritual, then we run a very dangerous risk, in the sense that we will overemphasize the materialistic and that which is strictly material and worldly, and we will overemphasize the purely physical, and will otherwise understand this sense of militarization only on an external material plane. Whereas our goal should be to undertake the right preparation with total seriousness, and to become externally, in our external form, merely the symbols and instruments of what is in fact, at its root, properly spiritual in its constitution and in what it needs.